Hi, my name is Hubwood and welcome to today's video in which we will take a closer look at the newest installment of Lenovo's Ideapad 5, which now comes with an MX450 with GDDR6 RAM and an i7-1165 G7. Now let's take a look at the specs first. The specific model that I've tested did cost me 999 euros and it comes with an i7-1165 G7 4-core 8-thread CPU with integrated Intel Iris Xe graphics. It has a turbo of 4.7 GHz on one and 4.1 GHz on all cores, which is 600 MHz more than the i7-1065 G7 provides. A Nvidia GeForce MX450 with 2GB DDR6, 16GB of soldered and pretty fast DDR4 3200 MHz in dual channel mode, which unfortunately can't be expanded, a 512GB NVMe SSD, a 15-inch Full HD IPS screen with 300 nits, a fingerprint sensor, a 70 Wh battery, a 65 Watt USB-C charger, a 720p webcam with privacy shutter. By the way, this is what the integrated camera looks like and the microphone sounds like. Wi-Fi 6 and a SD card reader, which is definitely a nice to have. And of course there will be versions with 8GB as well as AMD versions, which probably won't be available with the MX450 though, at least that's what I was able to find out yet. Now the case of this laptop is pretty much identical with the last version that I've tested. You can watch that video up here if you're interested, which came with an 1065 G7 i7 processor and the MX350. But there have been some minor changes about the monitor and the side panels, about the connections. One good thing is that you can now easily open the laptop with one hand, and the last version you had to do it very slow or push it down. And I like to have a laptop that I can open with one hand only. So thank you, Lenovo. The whole laptop weighs only around 1.66 kg and has a total height of around 20 millimeters. They say it's 18, but when I measured it looked like 20. It is well built and it has a subtle design, but to me it looks valuable, even though it's made 100% out of plastic. And in my opinion, it feels nice. I like the soft touch feel that it has. The display, it seems sturdy enough to me. And of course, being an IPS display, it has nice viewing angles. As said before, it comes with a maximum brightness of 300 nits, which is fine for me, but it's not intended for outside use in the sun. The colors are vivid and the contrast seemed fine to me. And as soon as I know the coverage of sRGB in Adobe, I will post it in a sticky comment. Now the power button comes with an integrated fingerprint sensor, which worked for me around 99% of the times. The illuminated keyboard and the touchpad seem to be pretty much the same as in the previous version, and I have to say I do like them both. They feel valuable and are nice to work with, even though I prefer using a mouse, of course. The speakers actually provide an okay quality as well as Dolby Audio, and the sound is not distorted, but it lacks bass and it could be a bit louder overall. But for me it's always a plus if a speaker on a laptop is directed towards the user and not towards the table. Now let's take a look at the connections. On the left side we have a USB-C port, which at the same time is the power plug-in for the PSU, and I guess that also answers the question if it's possible to charge the device via USB-C. The USB-C port also has the ability to support DisplayPort 1.4, meaning that you would have to use some kind of advanced USB hub or converter if you want to charge it at the same time, so keep that in mind. And then we have the HDMI 1.4 port and a regular 3-inch jack that combines headphones and microphone. On the right side we have 2x USB 3.2 ports, an SD card reader and the microphone, which is identical to the previous Ideapad 5, and that's it. Meaning we have only 2 regular USB ports. For me personally, that is not enough. Yes, there is the additional USB-C port, but that is occupied when loading the laptop. Second, I don't like to have more than one USB port on the right side of a laptop, as connecting something will usually get in the way of your mouse, especially if you don't have much space. And I prefer laptops with a LAN connection, but I get that it's not going to happen often these days with small ultrabooks. The battery. It's a 70 Wh battery and is actually right in the middle of what many laptops offer these days, so we should get okay results. Unfortunately, the 70 Wh battery is actually discharging around 8% per hour while gaming on the heavy load, even when the laptop is plugged in. It's not like this never happens in laptops, it's happening in my gaming laptop, which has an i7 and a GTX 1060, but it's not nice if it does. When the battery is reaching 10%, the laptop will throttle and you lose around 25% performance to prevent further discharging. I guess it would take at least 10 to 12 hours to reach that 10% limit when being plugged in and starting at 100% though. And after researching on the Lenovo website, there seems to be no official stronger PSU than the 65 watt one. I don't know if a third-party 100 watt charger would prevent that from happening. Now, as expected, the battery times are pretty okay. I achieved 57 minutes of gaming on the full load playing Cyberpunk 2077 and 67 minutes running the Unigine Heaven benchmark without any energy saving methods and 90% display brightness. But that game really puts GPU and CPU under full pressure almost all the time. I have to point out in a positive way that the laptop doesn't perform much slower in gaming when unplugged, as it only affects the CPU boost clock and not the Nvidia MX450. You probably won't notice any difference at all in titles that aren't very intense on the CPU. You will get worse frame times and some hiccups here and there though, and that might disturb you if you're sensible to that. Due to the lower CPU boost clock, also note that lighter gaming, especially if you can limit the FPS to 60, would get you even longer battery times. Watching YouTube in energy saving mode with around 50% brightness got me 6 hours and 8 minutes. And the idle time in energy saving mode with activated Wi-Fi and the display brightness of 50% was a very impressive 21 hours and 47 minutes. In 30 minutes the laptop is charging from 4 to 49%, meaning that it's charging 45% in 30 minutes. In additional 30 minutes I was charging from 49% to 86%, that means it's charged around 82% total in 60 minutes. So it takes less than 90 minutes or 1.5 hours to fully charge the laptop from 0 to 100. Now, considering performance, let's start with the SSD drive speed, which is what you would expect in an ultrabook these days. Around 1000 megabytes of sequential writing speed and around 2000 megabytes of reading speed. That's absolutely fast enough for a laptop like this. Even though I would really favor 1 terabyte of capacity at this price point, to be honest. There will be versions with bigger SSDs though. Please be aware that you cannot install a second regular HDD or SSD, as there is no available SATA slot. The CPU has a 28 watt TDP and is pretty consistent in its performance when plugged in. That resulted in an initial Cinebench R15 score of 1042 and around 960 after a few runs, which according to notebookcheck.com places it at the absolute top of laptops with this CPU, and I also consider the long-term performance exceptional. But if unplugged, I only got a score of 400, which is kind of weird because in Cinebench R23 I didn't have that issue. In Cinebench R23 it achieved a score of 6340 in the first run and around 6180 after a few runs. That's still noticeably slower than AMD's 4700U, but it's still fast enough for everyday tasks and even heavier work-related stuff, as well as video editing and 3D stuff. For some reason the scores were absolutely identical in the first run when unplugged. I don't know why Cinebench R15 performed so much slower in that case. I retested both tests to be sure and getting the same result again. Weird. Now let's talk about the gaming performance. In 3D Mark Firestrike I was getting a complete score of 5122 and the graphics score of 5431. That is indeed around 15% higher than the MX450 with DDR5, which achieved a graphics score of 4700. But in some games the difference is actually even higher, and in some there's almost no difference at all. In TimeSpy I achieved a total score of 1365 with a graphics score of 1215 and a CPU score of 4578. I made a video in which I compared the DDR5 with the DDR6 version, so make sure to check that one out to get some extended information about the gaming performance. I will also link it in the description, of course. But in general, you can play every game that's out there. But of course, in newer titles, you would have to crank down the resolution and the graphics a bit. For example, in Cyberpunk 2077, you would want to use 900p or 720p to get fluent gameplay. But then it will work pretty okay actually. But even some middle-aged AAA titles like The Witcher 3 will actually run really well on 1080p and medium settings. Actually, in this example I was almost getting an average of 60 FPS. In Battlefield 5 I saw around 45 to 55 FPS on the low preset. And even Red Dead Redemption 2 would work at 1080p if you choose the absolute lowest settings. Or you could use 720p or 900p and crank up the settings, which I actually would prefer because on the very low setting the game doesn't look that well. In the case of Red Dead Redemption 2, anything else than very low and 1080p would be a problem because the small VRAM will stop the game from actually working or accepting the settings. And that is a bummer. That's not Lenovo's fault, of course, but because the chip itself is actually fast enough to provide decent FPS for medium or high settings in many games, it's a shame. Nvidia should have at least used 3GB or 4GB, but actually they just don't consider the MX series as a real gaming card. Of course, lighter stuff like Rocket League will work like a charm with over 100 FPS on average, even on ultra settings. Fortnite, Overwatch, League of Legends and such will run perfectly fine with much more than 60 FPS as well, of course. Now the temperatures. I noticed that actually lifting the laptop under load like this a bit and placing something below would drastically reduce temperatures. We're talking about 5 to 10 degrees here. Undervolting actually is not possible as Intel locks their new CPUs from doing that. They cannot be undervolted anymore in any way as far as I'm aware. By the way, I ran all the gaming tests under the performance mode by Lenovo, which ramps up the fans a bit more than the regular mode. Looking into that also made me notice that sometimes the GPU boost frequency heavily drops down to around 1400 MHz for no visible reason. At last, it's not because of the temperature. I'm guessing that it has to do something with the fact that the laptop is not providing enough power and that the battery discharges while gaming. The keyboard itself is not getting super warm under full load, and at least not in a way that I would consider uncomfortable. The noise level with regular usage is actually really silent. Only when gaming or rendering the fans really ramp up to a level which some might find slightly annoying, so you probably would want to use a headphone while gaming. Now as a conclusion, who should buy this laptop? Well, if you are okay with casual gaming, being restricted by the 2GB of VRAM, being okay with not having the fastest ultrabox CPU you can get for this money, and if a good mobility is more important to you than graphic performance, this laptop should be fine for you. It has no major flaws in my opinion, the build quality is really nice, and the performance is really good considering the size. Yes, it is good for students in my opinion. It should last a whole day at university in most cases. And before you ask, because I know you will, yes, it's perfectly fine for working with CAD, also known as CAD, and programming. If you don't need the dedicated graphics card because you neither game a lot or don't do any video editing at all and no 3D rendering, I would suggest getting a model with a AMD processor instead maybe. And even those could do some of those tasks in an okay way, as you will save money and probably get an even longer battery life. And the AMD 4000 series has a pretty decent integrated graphics as well, which allows at least for some light gaming. sometimes even at 1080p or 900p. But I have to shout out to Lenovo for allowing the Intel i7-1165G7 such a great performance in this laptop. If you enjoy this video, it would help a lot if you would subscribe or like the video. Thank you very much. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.